I want to be honest about what I ignored. That's the part that stays with me now, when I'm sitting somewhere quieter than I deserve, turning the whole thing over in my hands, like a stone I keep expecting to be different. I was a pediatric ER nurse for 11 years. I knew how to triage. I knew how to read a room, a body, a set of vitals that were lying to you. I knew that the first sign something was wrong was always the thing you explained away because you didn't have time to deal with it yet. I explained away the arrow. It was painted on the trunk of a fallen oak, cadmium yellow. The kind that doesn't wash out, applied with a wide brush in 2 clean strokes, deliberate. Recent enough that the paint hadn't fully oxidized at the edges. It pointed northeast, off the fire road we'd been using as a corridor since we abandoned the vehicle outside Carnell Township, roughly 90 minutes before that. The arrow was below eye level. You'd only see it if you were walking close to the tree line, which we were, because the road itself was no longer safe to walk openly. There were 5 of us at that point. Me, which is Dara Osei. Beside me, Marcus Pruitt, who had been a high school wrestling coach and who had not, in the 4 days since we'd left the school gymnasium where we'd been sheltering, said anything I would describe as reassuring. He was steady in the way that some people go steady when fear has finished cycling through its options and landed on silence. Next to him, Gemma Toll, 43, who had been a pediatric pharmacist and who I'd worked alongside for 6 years before any of this, and whose presence in that gymnasium had been the thing that made me stay 2 days longer than I planned. Behind us, a man named Rourke, who had not told us his first name and who we had not asked. Because in the first hours of meeting him, it became clear that he had experienced something specific and recent, and that asking him questions about himself produced a particular stillness in his face that none of us wanted to be responsible for. And the last one was Celia, who was 16, and who was alive because Gemma had pulled her out of a car on the highway overpass 2 days in. Celia saw the arrow first. "That's new," she said, not alarmed, just noting it, the way you note a sound in a hospital corridor that doesn't match the ambient noise, the thing your brain flags before your attention arrives. Marcus looked at it for 3 seconds. "Could be old." "It's not," I said. That was the full extent of our deliberation. I want to be clear about that, because I think people imagine that decisions like the one we made next involve more architecture, more back and forth, more surviving characters carefully weighing evidence. What actually happens is that you've been walking for 4 hours. 2 people in your group are showing early signs of dehydration. The tree line behind you produced sounds 40 minutes ago that you've been working not to think about. And a yellow arrow pointing towards something unspecified feels like a gift from a world that has not given you anything in 4 days. We turned northeast. The infected found us 11 minutes later, before we reached anything the arrow was pointing toward. There were 3 of them, moving along a creek bed that ran parallel to our new heading. And they found us before we found them because the creek noise had been masking the particular sound they make when they move through undergrowth. That sound. I'm not going to describe it in clinical terms because the clinical terms are accurate, but they don't capture what it does to the body to hear it. What I'll say is that your nervous system responds before your mind does. Your legs are already changing direction while your brain is still classifying the input. Marcus handled it. I don't mean that gracefully or with action sequence precision. I mean, he put himself between them and Celia and Gemma, and he did what needed doing with a collapsed tent pole, and about 45 seconds of something that was loud and terrible, and that I was simultaneously present for, and will not fully reconstruct here. By the time it was over, Rourke had his hand pressed flat against the bark of a tree and was breathing in a way that told me he'd been somewhere very similar to this before, recently, and had lost someone in it. "We need to keep moving," Gemma said. We did. The shelter announced itself through smell before it announced itself through sight. I've worked in hospitals long enough to identify what clean air smells like when it's been mechanically produced, when it's been filtered and recirculated and stripped of the particular biological signatures that accumulate in a space where bodies have been living and breathing for any length of time. It has a neutrality that is slightly wrong, not unpleasant, just too consistent, like a sample of silence rather than silence itself. Walking through a forest where the ambient smell was wet bark, disturbed soil, and the iron-cold smell that had been following us since the creek. The sudden appearance of that neutral mechanical cleanliness was disorienting in a way I didn't immediately have language for. I stopped walking. Gemma, who was close behind me, nearly walked into my back. "What?" she said. "Do you smell that?" She did. I watched her face move through the same sequence mine had. Recognition, confusion, then a very careful recalibration. It took us another 6 minutes to find the entrance, because it was designed not to be found. The hatch was set into a concrete collar at the base of a limestone outcropping, disguised by a corrugated steel cover that had been spray-painted to match the rock's surface, with a level of precision that suggested either a professional scenic background or someone with an obsessive relationship to concealment. There was no handle visible from above. The cover was hinged on the interior. What there was, beside the left edge of the cover, was a small recessed panel with a mechanical keypad, and above the keypad, scratched into the limestone itself in letters approximately 1 centimeter high, "Open, 7,741. Marcus looked at Gemma. Gemma looked at me. "Someone left that for someone," Celia said. She meant the code, scratched into the rock face rather than written on paper, because paper doesn't last outside, but limestone does. Someone had wanted this specific sequence to survive weather and time and be findable by someone arriving exactly the way we had arrived, on foot from the southwest, following a yellow arrow, with nothing. I punched in the code. The hatch released with a sound like a pressure differential equalizing, a controlled exhale. Warm air moved upward past my face, and with it came that same filtered neutrality, stronger now. And underneath it something I placed only a beat later. Ozone. The specific metallic tang of active air purification equipment, not emergency backup, running equipment. This shelter had power, and its systems were currently operating. The ladder descended into warm, yellow light. I went first, because that is the decision I made, and I'm not going to dress it in any more courage than it was. The truth is, I went first because I was the one who'd entered the code. And entering the code had made me responsible for what the code opened. And I have never in my life been able to make myself responsible for something and then stand at the edge of it and let someone else go first. The others followed. Rourke came last and pulled the hatch shut above him. The sound it made closing was not the sound of a door. It was the sound of a seal. I noted that. I filed it. I told myself we could open it from the inside, and I believed that and moved forward. There are the things you know and the things you need to be true. And in the early hours of something like this, they can coexist without conflict. And the mistake is in assuming they'll stay that way. The main chamber was designed to make you feel safe. I understand that now in a way I didn't then. That the feeling itself was a data point, not a neutral condition. At the time, I registered it as relief. And relief was so rare by that point that I didn't interrogate its source. The space was roughly 14 meters long and 8 wide, with a ceiling height that defied what you'd expect from a buried structure, nearly 3 meters, with overhead panels that produced a light spectrum close enough to natural daylight that my body stopped bracing within minutes of entering. That was the first thing I should have flagged. Light spectrum normalization is not a feature in emergency shelters. It's a feature in research environments where biological circadian function is a variable being managed. I didn't flag it. I sat down on a padded bench along the east wall, and I looked at my people, and for approximately 4 minutes, I let myself simply be glad we were inside. The inventory was thorough in ways that emergency preppers don't achieve. Not the maximalist accumulation of someone who'd bought out a survival warehouse, but the precise, category-organized sufficiency of someone who had thought carefully about what a specific number of people would need for a specific duration. Food stores sealed in vacuum packaging, labeled in a font that was not commercial, printed in-house on a label maker, with measurements and caloric content listed with the precision of a clinical nutrition protocol rather than a camping checklist. Medical supplies in a wall cabinet that, when Gemma opened it, produced a silence between us that lasted several seconds before she said quietly, "This is a clinical inventory." She was right. The cabinet didn't contain a first aid kit. It contained organized pharmaceutical stock, analgesics, antivirals, a course of broad-spectrum antibiotics arranged by generation. I could open it from the inside, and I believed that and moved forward. There are the things you know, and the things you need to be true. And in the early hours of something like this, they can coexist without conflict. And the mistake is in assuming they'll stay that way. The main chamber was designed to make you feel safe. I understand that now in a way I didn't then. That the feeling itself was a data point, not a neutral condition. At the time, I registered it as relief. And relief was so rare by that point that I didn't interrogate its source. The space was roughly 14 meters long and 8 wide, with a ceiling height that defied what you'd expect from a buried structure, nearly 3 meters, with overhead panels that produced a light spectrum close enough to natural daylight that my body stopped bracing within minutes of entering. That was the first thing I should have flagged. Light spectrum normalization is not a feature in emergency shelters. It's a feature in research environments where biological circadian function is a variable being managed. I didn't flag it. I sat down on a padded bench along the east wall, and I looked at my people, and for approximately 4 minutes, I let myself simply be glad we were inside. The inventory was thorough in ways that emergency preppers don't achieve. Not the maximalist accumulation of someone who'd bought out a survival warehouse, but the precise, category-organized sufficiency of someone who had thought carefully about what a specific number of people would need for a specific duration. Food stores sealed in vacuum packaging, labeled in a font that was not commercial, printed in-house on a label maker, with measurements and caloric content listed with the precision of a clinical nutrition protocol rather than a camping checklist. Medical supplies in a wall cabinet that, when Gemma opened it, produced a silence between us that lasted several seconds before she said quietly, "This is a clinical inventory." She was right. The cabinet didn't contain a first aid kit. It contained organized pharmaceutical stock, analgesics, antivirals, a course of broad-spectrum antibiotics arranged by generation, IV supplies with labeled bag volumes, a pulse oximeter still in its clinical packaging, and this is the one that lodged in my throat, a pediatric dosage chart laminated and affixed to the inside of the cabinet door. "Someone planned for children," Celia said from behind Gemma's shoulder. Gemma closed the cabinet. She looked at me with the specific expression of a pharmacist who has just seen something that doesn't belong in the category it's been placed in. And that expression told me she was filing the same observation I was, and that neither of us was ready to say it out loud yet. Marcus was moving through the space methodically, which was his nature. Perimeter first, then center, then the transitions. He found the second room behind a pressure door at the north end. A dormitory space with 6 berths, 2 sets of 3 stacked cleanly against opposing walls, each with a reading panel above the pillow position, adjustable for angle and intensity. He found the bathroom, functional, with water running. He found what he initially described as a storage room, and which turned out, when I looked at it, to be a monitoring station. I stood in the doorway of that room for a long time. It was compact, perhaps 3 meters by 2. 1 desk, built in, 1 chair bolted to the floor. Above the desk, a rack of equipment that had been carefully powered down and covered with a fitted dust cloth, the kind that is cut and hemmed to fit a specific piece of equipment and not purchased generically. The desk surface itself was clear, except for 2 things: a logbook, its cover unremarkable dark blue, and a small printed placard, the laminated kind you find beside institutional equipment, that read, "Observation Station B. Active data collection paused. Do not power cycle." I picked up the logbook. I opened it to the middle. The entries were clinical in format and unambiguous in their subject. Date, time, notation. Intake, observation window. Behavioral and biometric markers. Columns for respiratory rate, sleep duration, caloric consumption, social interaction frequency. And at the top of each page, a header field that read, "Subject Group Designation." The header on every page I turned to was blank, waiting to be filled in. I didn't tell the others what I found in the monitoring room, not that night. I want to explain that without justifying it, because I've turned the decision over enough times to understand that explanation and justification are different things, and that I owe the honest version rather than the defensible one. The honest version is this. Gemma had just gotten Celia's shoes off and was examining a hot spot on her left heel that was 2 days from becoming a serious problem. Rourke had eaten, voluntarily, without prompting, for the first time since we'd met him, and had fallen asleep on one of the berths with the boneless completeness of a body that had been refusing rest for too long. Marcus was running water and looking at his own hands in a way that told me he was processing something that required the privacy of running water. And Celia had asked, in the careful voice of someone who has learned not to ask questions that could ruin things, whether she could charge her phone from the wall outlet she'd found, even though there was no signal and there would be no signal, just because she wanted the battery number to not be at 4% anymore. I said yes, and I stood in the corridor between the monitoring room and the main chamber, and I held the logbook, and I made the decision that they needed this night, that I needed this night, that whatever the logbook meant, it was a problem I could carry alone until morning, and that my capacity to carry it was better after sleep than before it. I was not wrong about that. I want to be clear. I don't think I was wrong about that. What I was wrong about was thinking that carrying it alone until morning was where the carrying would stop. I read the logbook in its entirety in the monitoring room, with the door pulled nearly closed and the light at its lowest setting. It took me 2 hours and 40 minutes, because the entries were dense, and because I kept stopping and going back. The handwriting was small and precise and belonged to someone with a scientific education. I've read enough clinical documentation to recognize the specific economy of someone who has been trained to record what was observed, not what was felt. The entries began approximately 22 months before the date I was reading them. They described, in retrospective setup notation, the construction rationale, equipment calibration, and design parameters of the shelter. They described the light spectrum panels and their circadian entrainment function. They described the air filtration system and its capacity to introduce or withhold specific atmospheric variables. They described the food stores and their measured caloric precision. They described the medical cabinet and its population anticipatory inventory. They described without apology or apparent awareness of needing to offer one. A facility designed to observe how a small group of uninfected survivors would behave in a sealed, resource-sufficient, stress-controlled environment during the outbreak period. Not to protect people, to watch them being protected, and to record what that did. The final entry was dated 11 weeks earlier. The author's last line, written in the same small, precise hand as every line before it, read, "Initiating hibernation protocol. Facility viable. Awaiting subject group." I closed the logbook. I sat in the chair that was bolted to the floor in front of the blank subject group designation fields. Outside the shelter, somewhere in the forest we had walked through, something moved through the underbrush in the particular pattern that meant it had been human once. I sat there for another hour before I went to the berth that was left for me, and lay down, and stared at the ceiling panel glowing its counterfeit daylight at a melatonin-suppressing reduction of the hour's earlier setting. And I thought, someone calibrated that. Someone calibrated that for this room, for a body in this berth, for a sleep window. They wanted to be a specific length. I slept. That is the part I find hardest to say without flinching. I slept, and it was the best sleep I had gotten in 2 weeks. And the shelter wanted exactly that from me. Gemma knew by morning, not because I told her, because she was a pharmacist who had spent the night with access to that medical cabinet, and because she was, as she had always been, better than me at sitting with a disturbing observation long enough to let it complete its shape. She was standing at the cabinet when I came into the main chamber. The door was open. She was holding the laminated pediatric dosage chart and looking at it with an expression I recognized from 6 years of working beside her. The expression she wore when a prescription came through that the numbers on it were technically legal, but that something in her, some accumulated clinical sixth sense, told her the prescribing intention was wrong. "The dosing chart covers ages 2 through 14, she said, without looking up. But the weight ranges on the IV fluid protocols extend down to 8 kilograms. 8 kilograms is an infant. A large infant, but an infant. "Gemma," I said, "the antivirals are dosed for prophylactic use, not treatment. You don't stock prophylactic doses in an emergency shelter unless you're planning for a population that's going to be here long enough to complete a prophylactic course." She put the chart back, precisely in its exact position. "And the sleep panels. I woke up at 6 hours, exactly. Not because I was done sleeping, because the light changed, and I came awake, and I was not. I did not choose to be awake. The light scheduled me." She turned around. "What did you find in that room?" she said. Not a question. I told her everything. I did it quietly, standing in the main chamber, with one eye on the dormitory door, and she listened in the way she always listened, completely still, processing continuously, giving nothing away on her face until she was ready. When I finished, she said, "How long have we been in here?" 14 hours? The observation protocol in the logbook. Does it specify a minimum data window before the collection period is considered viable? I had read that section 4 times. 72 hours of baseline behavioral data. She looked at the dormitory door. Behind it, we could both hear the sound of Marcus moving. Rourke still quiet, Celia's voice asking something in the half-awake register of a teenager who has slept well for the first time in days. "We have 58 hours before we become a complete data set," Gemma said. That was the moment the shelter became a different kind of problem. Not a mystery, not an unsettling coincidence of design. A clock. Telling Marcus was not like telling Gemma. Gemma received information and reorganized around it. Marcus received information and tested it against every wall available until he was satisfied it was solid, or until he'd found the place it gave way. And the process was audible and required space, and occasionally needed to happen in a direction that wasn't directly at the person who delivered the news. He sat with it for about 6 minutes, during which he stood at the north end of the main chamber with his back to us and said nothing. And at the end of the 6 minutes, he turned around and said, "Who built it?" "I don't know," I said. "The logbook doesn't include a name, an institution, a funding source. Government? Possibly. Possibly private. The construction quality suggests significant resources. The research design suggests someone with a specific behavioral science background. But the outbreak phase framing suggests they were expecting the outbreak," Marcus said. "They were planning for a research opportunity within it. Whether they were expecting it specifically or planning contingently, I can't. They built this before it happened. That landed differently than the clinical explanation. It was the same information, but Marcus had compressed it into its ugliest shape. And the ugliest shape was correct. Someone had built a sealed observation environment and stocked it with precisely calibrated resources and waited for the world to produce the conditions that would drive uninformed subjects through an arrow-marked path into a biometric data collection facility. "We need to leave," he said. "I know." "Then why are we still talking?" "Because it's daytime. We have no confirmed route. And when I came up from the hatch this morning to assess the exterior, I counted 9 infected within visual range of the entrance. Active, moving, not clustered, distributed across the approach corridor." I let that sit for a moment. The shelter keeps us alive while we're in it. That's still true. The design is compromised. The safety isn't. "The design is the safety," Marcus said. "That's the problem." He wasn't wrong. Rourke had been sitting at the far end of the bench during this exchange, and he spoke for the first time, in the flat, removed tone he used when he was choosing his words rather than producing them. "There's a monitoring system in that back room. You said it was powered down." Covered and powered down. Who powered it down? I had asked myself the same question at 2 a.m. and had not arrived at a satisfying answer. The logbook entries stopped 11 weeks ago. The equipment had been powered down and covered. The entrance code had been scratched into the rock face. These 3 facts, taken together, suggested the person who built this had left, or had planned to return, or had wanted someone to enter without being observed, which contradicted the entire design architecture, unless the design had changed. "I don't know," I said. Rourke nodded slowly, the nod of someone filing an unanswered question as a known variable rather than resolving it. "Then we need to know," he said, "before we make any other decisions." Celia found the secondary logbook. I should have found it. I had gone through that monitoring room with care, but I had gone through it in the middle of the night with a low-level light source and the specific attentional narrowing that comes from reading something distressing for 2 straight hours. And what I had missed, what I had filed as a drawer handle and moved past, was a false panel in the desk structure, 2 centimeters of additional depth behind the shallow instrument drawer, accessed by pressing the panel inward rather than pulling it out. Celia found it because she had the spatial instinct of someone who had grown up in a house where things were hidden. She pressed the panel and it released, and inside was a composition notebook, smaller than the clinical logbook, its cover warped slightly from humidity. She brought it to me without opening it, which was a kind of deference I did not expect from her. And that told me she was more frightened than she was showing. This logbook had a name on the inside cover. Dr. Nora Vess. Personal record. If found, read from the back. I read from the back. The final entry was dated 9 weeks earlier. 2 weeks after the clinical logbook's last entry. It was 3 pages long. Nora Vess had written it in a hand that was different from the clinical record. Looser, occasionally crossed out, the handwriting of someone writing for themselves rather than for documentation. She had built the shelter. She had funded it privately through a research endowment attached to a university program she declined to name. She had designed the observation protocol. She had calibrated the systems. She had scratched the entry code into the rock and painted the yellow arrow and arranged the approach path before the outbreak, when she had still expected to be present for the study. She had done all of this because she believed, with a conviction she acknowledged was not entirely scientific, that observing small group human behavior during acute crisis conditions would produce data that could not be ethically generated under controlled pre-outbreak conditions. She had rationalized it in the logbook. She had written the rationalizations in clinical language, and they were recognizable to me in the way that clinical language used to soften an ugly truth is always recognizable. The syntax gets more careful exactly where the ethics get worse. But the final entry was different. The final entry had been written 9 weeks earlier, after she had left the shelter, after she had decided not to return, after something had changed her. She had encountered a group of survivors 4 kilometers northeast. A family, 2 adults, 3 children, the youngest 8 months old. She had been carrying her data collection materials. She had encountered this family in a specific state of distress, and she had stopped. Not performed a field intake assessment, not noted their behavioral markers, stopped. She had spent 6 days with them. She had contributed the medical supplies she was carrying. The 8-month-old had developed a respiratory infection, and she had sat up 2 nights running the fever management protocol that she had calibrated for a research subject and deployed instead for a child who was simply sick and frightened and alive. The final lines of the entry read, "I powered down the observation station. I scratched the code in the rock. I painted the arrow because if someone finds this place, they should be able to enter it, and whatever they do inside it should be theirs. I have 37 pages of clean data from my calibration runs. I'm going to carry them for a while. I don't know yet if I'm going to burn them. I know that I should. The question of what I built this to be and what it actually is when a person is standing in it and just trying to not be afraid anymore. Those 2 things are not reconcilable, and I'm not going to pretend they are by staying inside it." I sat with Celia in the monitoring room, and we read that last paragraph twice. "She left," Celia said. "She left. Then nobody's watching." I looked at the covered equipment above the desk, the fitted dust cloth, the placard that said, "Do not power cycle." "Nobody's watching," I said. The conversation I'd been dreading happened at the main table at what the shelter's light panels were indicating was late afternoon, though the panels had already lost my trust as a timekeeping system, and I was navigating by the hunger schedules of the people around me instead. I had told them everything by then. The clinical logbook, the monitoring station, the design architecture, the observation protocol, the 72-hour data threshold. And now I told them about Nora Vess's personal record, the family she had found, the code scratched in the rock, and the equipment she had powered down herself before she walked away. I told it all in sequence. I tried not to editorialize. I have spent 11 years delivering information to families in corridors outside pediatric emergency rooms. And I learned in that work that the quality of the information is not improved by the manner of its delivery, that what people need is the actual thing, and that softening or framing is often more about the teller than the listener. When I finished, Marcus said, "So it's clean now. The observation equipment is powered down and covered. If no one powers it back up, then yes, the systems are running, but no one is collecting data." but the systems are still doing what they were designed to do. The filtration and the light panels and the food stores. Yes, those are operating. Is that different? Rourke said. Whether or not it's recording. Is surviving inside a place that was built to study you different from surviving inside it when the study has stopped? That was the question, the one I'd been sitting with since 2 a.m. and had not been able to answer, and which I was relieved, in a complicated way, to hear articulated by someone else. Gemma answered it. She answered it as she answered most things, not forcefully, but with the specificity of someone who had been thinking about it longer than the conversation had been happening. The recording was always incidental, she said. The shelter functions the same whether or not there's data going into a notebook. The food is real. The air is real. The medical supplies are real. What was compromised was the consent architecture, and the consent architecture has been replaced by someone who left us a door and a code and made the choice for us by not being here to make it differently. She looked at the logbook on the table. Nora Vess built something to study people, and then she met a sick baby, and she became the thing she built the shelter to study. And I think the shelter is ours now, in the way that she meant when she scratched that code in the rock. No one said anything for a moment. I want to stay, Celia said. I'm saying that clearly because I'm not going to pretend I don't. I know, I said. And I'm not just saying it because I'm tired or because going outside is terrifying, even though both of those things are true. I'm saying it because she designed this place to keep people alive. And then she left it open on purpose. And the only reason to leave something open on purpose is because you want someone to be able to use it. She was 16. She had been pulled from a car by Gemma 48 hours into this. She had watched Marcus handle 3 infected with a tent pole and had not looked away, and had not cried afterward, and had asked to charge her phone so that the battery percentage would be a number that didn't feel like a countdown. She was the most honest person at that table, and she was right, and I hated that the right thing was also the comfortable thing. Because I have learned in 11 years of working in emergency medicine that when the right thing is also the comfortable thing, you have to interrogate your certainty twice. 2 more days, I said. We treat this as our shelter. We assess the exterior approach each morning. On the 3rd day, we decide whether we stay or we plan movement. Marcus nodded once. Rourke looked at the door to the monitoring room. The equipment stays covered, he said. The equipment stays covered, I agreed. On the 2nd full day, the ventilation system changed. I know what I said. I know we had agreed the shelter was ours. I know the clinical logbook was in my hands and not on the wall, and that the monitoring station was under its fitted cloth and the power cycle switch had not been touched. None of that changes what happened to the air on the 2nd full day, which is that at hour 38 of our occupancy, the ambient temperature dropped by approximately 1.5 degrees. And the particular quality of the filtered air shifted in a way I could not precisely quantify, but that my body registered as an increase in alertness that was not coming from inside me. I noticed because I'm a nurse, and my relationship to what is happening in my own body is professional, not detached, but disciplined. I noticed because I had been tracking our sleep duration since we arrived, and the pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. 6 hours for each of us on the first night, within a 40-minute window of each other. 7.5 on the second, which I had initially read as recovery sleep, but which now had the slightly too smooth quality of a scheduled increase. I sat at the main table at what was probably 3 a.m, with the clinical logbook open to the ventilation section, and I read about circadian phase shifting and controlled alertness induction through atmospheric oxygen variation, and I thought, this is still happening. The recording is stopped. The study is over, and the systems are still running the protocol, because no one told them to stop, because they were designed to run without supervision once initiated. Because the person who designed them built them for an experiment that doesn't know it was canceled. I thought about waking Gemma. I thought about it for a long time. What I decided instead was to go to the monitoring station and read the equipment manual. The manual was in the second drawer, which I had found the first time. 62 pages, spiral-bound, written in the same in-house label format as the food stores. I sat with it for 2 hours, and I learned several things. The atmospheric systems were on a pre-programmed cycle that had been set before initiation, and they could be interrupted, but not reset without a specific shutdown sequence. The shutdown sequence required powering on the central observation unit, the equipment under the dust cloth, running a single command through its interface, and then performing the power down correctly. Doing it wrong would lock the cycle permanently. Doing it right required turning on a system I had committed, in front of all of them, to leaving covered. I sat with that for a long time. The thing about working in pediatric emergency medicine is that you develop a very clear relationship with interventions that require doing something uncomfortable in order to prevent something worse. You learn that the discomfort of the intervention is not a reason to avoid it. You learn that the question is, not does this feel like a violation, but what happens if I don't do it? What happened if I didn't interrupt the protocol was that we stayed in a shelter that was actively managing our neurological states. Our sleep, our alertness, our caloric behavior. Without our knowledge and without the ability to distinguish between our own choices and the choices the building was making for us. I powered on the observation unit. The screen came up blue and empty. No active recording, no subject designation filled in. Just the interface, waiting. I ran the shutdown command. The ventilation shifted, subtly. The 1.5 degrees came back. The quality of the air changed again. And this time what it settled into was simply air, unmanaged, unscheduled, belonging to the room and to us, and to no one's research protocol. I powered the unit down. I replaced the dust cloth. I went back to my berth, and I lay in the dark that was genuinely dark, because the ceiling panels were off, because no circadian calibration was running, because the room was just a room now, and I was just a person in it. And I slept for 5 hours and 40 minutes, because that was what my body needed. It was the worst sleep I'd gotten since we arrived. It was the first sleep that was mine. I told them in the morning, before anything else, not because I had decided overnight that transparency was the correct operating principle. I had believed that before. I told them because the decision to power on the observation unit, even briefly, even for the purpose of shutting the system down, was a decision that affected all of them, made in a room behind a door they hadn't been watching. And if there is a category of thing I have no right to decide alone, it is the category of what gets done to other people without their knowledge. Marcus's response was to look at his hands. Not in the processing at the sink way, in the specific stillness of someone who has been lied to enough times that the discovery of honesty arriving after the fact feels almost the same. You should have woken us, he said. I should have woken you, I said. I'm not angry, he said, which I believed because Marcus's anger was not a quiet thing, and the room was quiet. I understand why you didn't. I understand the math of it. I just want it to not happen again. It won't, I said. Rourke was watching me with an expression that had something in it I couldn't fully classify. It wasn't approval, it wasn't forgiveness. It was the expression of someone updating an assessment. He had been assessing me since the first hour, and I'd never been sure what criteria he was using. And I was still not sure, but something in the update felt like it landed on the right side. The air is different, Celia said. Yes. I slept worse. Yes, the system was managing our sleep duration. Now it isn't. She considered this. That's better, right? Even though it feels worse. That's exactly right, Gemma said from the cabinet, where she was making a careful inventory of what we had consumed versus what remained. The feeling of it being managed was comfort. The comfort was real. The management was the problem. How do we know the difference? Celia said. Going forward, how do we know when we're choosing something versus when something's been arranged for us to choose? Nobody answered. It was not a question with an answer in that room. It may not have an answer in any room. We spent the third day in preparation rather than decision, because by the third morning, the decision had made itself through accumulation rather than through a single identifiable moment. What had accumulated? Rourke had been running daily exterior assessments through the hatch, brief and careful, no more than 90 seconds each. And his count of active infected in the approach corridor had gone from 9 on the first day to 6 on the second to 4 on the third, with no fresh arrivals from the road to the west. The pattern suggested the drift. They were moving through rather than clustering, which meant the corridor wasn't a sustained threat, but an intermittent one. And the window of low-density movement was now and was not guaranteed to reopen. What had also accumulated? The food stores were sufficient for an extended stay. We had not made a meaningful dent. The medical cabinet was similarly intact. There was no resource pressure forcing us out. The shelter would hold us for weeks if we let it. That was the weight of it. That the shelter would hold us, and that staying was comfortable, and that comfortable had been revealed as something other than trustworthy, not because the shelter was still deceiving us. It wasn't. We'd stopped that. But because the instinct to stay in a safe place is not always the same as the wisdom to do so. And I was a nurse who had watched families stay in situations past the point of staying, because the alternative required them to move towards something uncertain, and uncertain felt like danger even when staying was the actual danger. We packed what we could carry. Gemma organized the medical supplies into 2 bags with the pharmacist's precision. Not everything, but the high-value density items. The antivirals, the antibiotics, the IV lines and their packaging. The pediatric dosing information she copied by hand onto an index card from the laminated chart. Because the laminated chart would stay and the card would come with us. Marcus repacked the food rations. He was thorough and fair, and did not take more than his carrying capacity, which was more than anyone else's. Rourke sharpened both knives. He did not comment on this. Celia charged everything that would charge. Her phone sat at 100% on the bench beside a portable battery she'd found in the supply closet, and which was now also at full capacity. She held both items in her hands for a moment before putting them in her bag. And I watched her face do something quiet and private that I didn't interrupt. I stood in the monitoring room for a few minutes. I looked at the covered equipment, dark under its fitted cloth, its shutdown completed, its observation protocol terminated. I looked at the desk and the 2 logbooks on it, the clinical record and Nora Vess's personal notebook. I looked at the blank subject designation header on the clinical log's open page. I closed the clinical logbook. I left Nora Vess's personal record open to the final entry. If someone else came through, I wanted the last thing they read to be the one that told them the shelter had already changed its mind about what it was. The exit took longer than it should have because of a choice Rourke made at the ladder. He went up first, and he took 60 seconds at the top before he signaled us through. And the 60 seconds compressed into the kind of time that has physical weight when you are standing at the bottom of a ladder in a sealed space, waiting for someone to confirm that the world outside has not reorganized itself against you in the last 12 hours. His signal was a single tap on the rung with his knuckle. We went up in order. Marcus, then Gemma, then Celia, then me. The air outside was cold and wet and smelled of soil and moving water and the particular biological density of a forest that has been receiving dead things into itself for weeks. After the shelter's controlled air, it was like stepping from a clean room into a world that had been having complex experiences in your absence. My nose parsed it in layers. The organic, the chemical trace of something carrying at a distance, the rain that had moved through overnight. Rourke had identified the 2 active infected visible from the hatch position and had mapped our exit trajectory around them. And we moved in the practiced quiet that we had developed over 4 days of practice now, which was not military quiet, but was survivor quiet. The kind generated by shared stakes rather than training. We moved northeast because Rourke had found, on his morning assessment, a smoke signature at approximately 3 kilometers in that direction that was too steady and managed to be accidental fire. Managed fire in a fixed location at 3 kilometers was the closest thing to a hope vector any of us had, and we moved toward it without discussing whether hope vectors could be wrong, because we had already had that conversation, and its conclusion was that you move toward the best available thing, and you stay ready for it to be something other than what you needed. And you do not mistake readiness for cynicism. Celia walked beside me for the first kilometer without speaking. Then she said quietly, "Do you think she's okay?" I knew she meant Nora Vess. "I don't know," I said. "The family she found, the baby. I don't know. I hope they're somewhere she built for different reasons." I thought about that while we walked. The shelter had been built for the wrong reasons. It had functioned correctly for us anyway, because the right reasons and the wrong reasons had built the same walls, the same clean air, the same warm light, the same carefully stocked cabinet with its pediatric dosage chart. The intention had been compromised, and the structure had been sound, and those 2 things had coexisted in the same 14 meters, and I was alive inside the contradiction of them. And I did not know what to do with that, except carry it. "Yeah," I said. "Me too." We reached the smoke at 3 hours and 40 minutes. It was a farmstead. 2 outbuildings still standing, the main house intact, a generator running on biodiesel in a shed behind the barn, and a group of 11 people who had been there for 19 days and had built their survival around the generator. A deep water pump, a root cellar with preserved food stores, and a rotating watch protocol that one of them, a former rural fire department coordinator named Soledad Vance, had organized with the quiet systemic authority of someone who had spent 20 years managing people in crisis conditions. We stood at the tree line for 4 minutes before we walked out. That is the protocol now. You stop, you assess, you count the people you can see and the exits you can identify, and you make a determination about the quality of what you're looking at. The quality of what we were looking at was a fire that was being managed, a perimeter that was being watched, people moving with the specific purposeful economy of a group that has been doing the same tasks long enough to have developed a rhythm. Soledad was the one who met us at the fence line. She looked at the 5 of us, at our bags, our boots, the specific wear pattern of people who have been moving for several days. And she asked 3 questions in order. How many, how long on the road, and did anyone need medical attention? I said 5, 4 days, and no. She held the gate open. The others went through the first. I stood for a moment on the outside of the gate, and I looked back at the tree line, at the direction we had come from, at the 3 kilometers of forest between this farm and an unmarked hatch in the ground that was even now sitting empty with its systems off, and its monitoring station under a dust cloth and a personal logbook open to a final entry that I hoped someone else would find and read before they had to feel the particular confusion of not knowing what the place they were surviving inside had wanted from them. Then I went through the gate. Soledad latched it behind me. I found out about Nora Vess 11 days after we arrived at the farmstead. Her name wasn't common, and Soledad had a contact protocol with 2 other survivor groups via hand radio. And information travels in ways that the old infrastructure determined and the new infrastructure makes strange. Leapfrog and incomplete, and sometimes arriving as a fragment that contains a name and a fact and nothing connecting them. What I received: a woman matching her approximate description had been traveling with a family group. 2 adults, 3 children, the youngest now approximately 7 months old, and had passed through a community at a crossroads some 40 kilometers west 3 weeks earlier. She had contributed medical expertise. She had stayed 4 days. She had left with a family group, moving south. That was all. It was enough. I sat with it in the way you sit with things that are not answers but are not nothing, the particular partial resolution that real life offers instead of the complete kind. The kind that doesn't tie anything but does confirm that the thread continues, that there is still a thread. Gemma found me sitting with it by the fence in the late afternoon light that was genuinely late afternoon light now, unmanaged and variable and mine. "I heard," she said. "Yeah." She sat beside me. We were quiet for a while. "The pediatric dosing card," she said eventually. "I still have it." "I know. I've used it twice already. Mrs. Okafor's son, and the Petrov boy when he came in with the road group." I nodded. The chart had been laminated and affixed to the inside of a cabinet door in a facility designed to observe people without their knowledge. Now it was a handwritten index card in Gemma's left breast pocket. And she had used it to treat 2 sick children in an open farmhouse kitchen where the decision about what the chart was for had been made by the person holding it rather than the person who printed it. I don't know how to resolve that cleanly. I've tried. What I can say is that the children were treated and the card was used for exactly what it specified, and that the intention of the person who made it and the intention of the person who used it were different in ways that matter, and arrived at the same place in ways that also matter. And that living inside that complexity is not the same as endorsing it, and that the complexity does not release you from gratitude, and that gratitude does not release you from the complexity. I woke up the next morning at 5 hours and 53 minutes, which was what my body decided, in an unmanaged room, without light calibration or atmospheric optimization. In the cold dark of a farmhouse that smelled like biodiesel and livestock and the dinner dishes from the night before, was not the shelter's best sleep. It was entirely mine. What I carry out of that shelter is not a clean lesson. I have tried to make it one, and it won't hold the shape. What I carry is this: a facility built to instrument human survival became the thing that preserved it, through the decision of one person to walk away and leave a door open, and through the decision of 5 people who did not know the door was ever something else to walk through it. The debt is real. The debt has no clean creditor. Nora Vess built something compromised and then changed her mind about what it was. And we arrived in the space between the thing it had been and the thing she left it as. And we survived inside that gap. I don't think I forgive the design. I don't think forgiveness is the correct category. What I think is that I am alive, and that Celia is alive, and that Gemma is in the next room right now with her index card and her competence and her 6 years of being someone I trust, and that Marcus is on the morning watch, and that Rourke told me his first name 3 days after we arrived here. It's Daniel. And that these are not compensations for the compromised thing. They are simply what is true alongside it. The shelter was built to watch us survive. We survived. We were the wrong kind of evidence for every conclusion it was designed to reach, because the conclusion we reached was to leave. That's the thing about a door left open by someone who changed their mind. It doesn't matter what the door was built for. It matters who decides what it means to walk through it. I decided. That part was mine.